Hey there, Wastelanders, and welcome back to War Games News Radio. My name's Ryan, and in this video, we are taking a look at the Liberty Prime Rules Expansion and Campaign Pack for Fallout Wasteland Warfare. It's just been released as of April 1st, and it's not an April Fool's joke, and we are going to take a look at this campaign in its entirety and break down all of the cool new rules that come along with Liberty Prime. You can get your hands on it for free at the Fallout Wasteland Warfare downloads page. Check out a link in the description down below if you want to follow along with me as we break down this campaign pack and rules expansion. So let's get to it right away. Let's take a look at what we've got. As of the filming of this video, the rules are out, but the unit cards as well as the weapon cards will be coming out in about a week's time. And while the individual cards aren't themselves readily available, we do have in this booklet a little preview of the cards. Prime has 3 stages. Now, each one of these 3 cards must be used when Prime is on the table, and they must be used sequentially. So if you want to have Liberty Prime in your force, you must have all 3 Liberty Prime cards. First things first, we're greeted with a little bit of a background of who and what Liberty Prime is. If you've played Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, you're probably painfully aware of what Liberty Prime is all about. So we'll skip through that and go into the good stuff, which are the general rules. It shouldn't be any surprise. Liberty Prime is a BOS model. He's a BOS faction unit. You can use him with other factions, and they go into that a little bit deeper into the rules, but for all intents and purposes, he's BOS. Another no-brainer, there can only be one Liberty Prime on the battlefield at any one time. And while it would be cool to do a Prime versus Prime battle, and I'm already now thinking in my head how wicked a scenario that would be, technically you can only have one Prime on the battlefield, and it probably makes sense because as you go into the rules, having 2 of these around would get a little bit nutty. Now, this is an interesting mechanic that's brand new to the game, and that's unlimited health. Liberty Prime has unlimited hit points because his endurance is set to X, so an infinite value in this case. So this comes into play because Liberty Prime himself can't be damaged, but as we go in down a little further, it's his subsystems here which can actually help bring Prime down. When you attack Prime, you attack his subsystems, and Prime also can't use, well, pretty much any item whatsoever. But at unlimited hit points, it's not like you're gonna need to jack him up with a robot repair kit. Prime can't share items or be a target for sharing items. Never affected by the effects of a boost, a creature, a danger, an event, an explorer, or stranger card, so he's immune to the Wasteland. Interesting here as well, Prime is never part of any randomization roll when shooting into close combat. So if Prime is the target, you're hitting Prime. Prime doesn't benefit from cover, which makes sense because he's like 1,000 feet tall. But this is an interesting one in that Liberty Prime can target models using ranged attacks while engaged as if it was not engaged. So that's kind of cool. So even if you've got a swarm of enemies all around Prime, he can target someone that's not engaged with him with either his lasers or his mini nukes. That's kind of cool. And this isn't just wild. Prime is considered to represent 10 models when determining which player has advantage. So I have a feeling if you've got Prime on the board, advantage is almost always going to go to your opponent unless the scenario states otherwise. Liberty Prime can move through all models' bases, just fully barging through. And all models, not just friendlies, may move through Liberty Prime's base but cannot finish activations on his base, which is kind of interesting. I mean, his base is basically a crumbled red rocket. I don't really see why maybe you couldn't use the base as terrain itself, but apparently, according to Prime's rules, you can't end a movement on the base itself. Skill checks made when performing quick actions with Liberty Prime are only successful on the result of a critical. Interesting. And Liberty Prime can never become heroic or clunky. Heroic, I mean, with a model like this, I mean, who really needs it at this stage of the game? But clunky is an interesting one because it comes with the Automatron expansion pack and reduces the caps cost by about 15% of any robots. So there's no way to reduce Prime's 1,000 point caps cost, making him by and large the most expensive model in the game. There's a couple other quick Liberty Prime specific rules. Moving through Liberty Prime, the area of his base is treated as difficult terrain, so really I don't know how you would ever move through that base unless you had a crazy wild movement. Disengaging from Liberty Prime, the enemy models disengaging from Prime are never subject to a quick attack of opportunity. Interesting to know there, so you can disengage freely from Liberty Prime. And as explained in the huge model rules, Liberty Prime counts as a huge model due to being mounted on a 180 millimeter base, and because of this, the base blocks line of sight. Models that are partially obscured by Prime can still claim cover if the line of cover crosses part of Prime's base. So he can be used as kind of a mobile bunker, which is cool. Getting back to these profile cards, Liberty Prime has that endurance attribute of X, meaning that the model itself can't be damaged. But how do you take down Prime then? Well, you do that by destroying any of his subsystems. Liberty Prime moves on to his next unit card each time one of its subsystem cards is flipped from undamaged to damage. So if you want to slowly chip Prime down through his stages, you have to destroy his subsystems. Now, as mentioned, we're still waiting on all of the subsystem and unit cards, but it says here that there will be 6 cards, and these contain all the information about the actions and abilities that Prime can do. Now, we've got an example of one of the cards here, and this is the Power Core subsystem. It says here that all of the subsystems start on their undamaged side, and when they take damage equal to the hit points, you can see that the Power Core here has 15. When this thing is damaged down to 15 hit points, you flip it over, and then it becomes damaged, and you would then move down a peg into the next stat card of Prime. So again, a little bit like legendary units, but instead of targeting the unit yourself, you target the individual systems. And it looks like some of these subsystems are also going to have active abilities and passive abilities. So we can see a handful of them here: Power Core, Targeting HUD, Gyroscopic Sensors, and Active Defense Matrix. When these are all active, they give Prime some extra little buffs here. So I can see why you're not allowed to use a heroic unit card with him, because keen viewers will notice that these are a lot of the buffs that a heroic card would give you normally. So when Prime has these different subsystems on the go, he gains, for example, access to critical points, quick action pistol shots, which I guess would probably be for his lasers, and then quick action attacks, and also luck. So now, in addition to his subsystem cards, Liberty Prime comes with 4 Liberty Prime specific weapons: the Liberty Laser, the Liberty Prime Punch, the Liberty Prime Stomp, and the Mark 28 Nuclear Bomb. We also get a little bit of a preview of the Mark 28 bomb here, and holy shit, this thing is wild. If you thought mini nukes were nuts, look at this thing. 8 damage in a green radius. This thing is unfreaking real. This is the gnarliest weapon in the whole game. Of course, Prime has the biggest weapon in the whole game. He's the biggest unit in the whole game. So yeah, this thing's devastating. Still waiting to see what all the other weapons do, but this is his big weapon, obviously. If we scroll back up to where we saw some of his unit cards, we can see that his big gun skill is based on a strength of 20. A strength of 20. So he's just always going to hit with this thing unless he rolls a fumble, at least on his first 2 cards. Strength of 20, strength of 14, like good luck missing. What's interesting with this weapon is that it doesn't scatter by the looks of it. So it's just going to either hit or miss. That's about it. That's about all. You can see that it also has a new range profile. So looking at it here, it's got a minimum no fly zone, no shooting range of yellow. So it can't fire off this nuke within yellow of itself. And then it has a short range of black, a long range of blue, and then an extra long range, they're calling it here, of green. So this is the first weapon profile to have this many range rulers. Standard is 2, so to have 3 of them involved is just crazy. But yeah, this is obviously going to be the end game, like, superpower weapon. I can only imagine what the lasers are going to do. So that's all well and good. We now have a good idea of what Prime is able to do on the battlefield, which is blow shit up, and we know that he's damn near invincible. So the question is, how do you play with Prime? Now, I've looked at this section already, and without going through every single word of this, I'll run it down for you real quick. Similar to how you activate units with readiness markers, you can put readiness markers on Liberty Prime's individual subsystems. So when it's your turn in a round, you can either put a readiness token on Liberty Prime's one of his many subsystems, or on one of your other standard models. All the standard activation and readiness rules apply, so when you activate one model, you must activate them all. But this gets a little bit tricky when Prime is involved, and you need to follow this matrix here. After you've assigned a readiness marker to a model or a Prime subsystem, if you then choose to activate all of your models like you normally do, you need to check and see if Prime has the minimum amount of readiness markers on one of his many subsystems. If one of his subsystems is ready to go and charged up, Prime is activated alongside all of the other models in your force, which means Prime can then perform any in-game actions or effect defined on any of its activated subsystems. Now, if none of the subsystems are powered up and ready to go, Liberty Prime is not activated, although all of the other models in your force can now go as usual. This is an interesting mechanic in that it's going to bring a level of strategy to Liberty Prime. It's not like you can just drop him on the table and he's going to destroy your opponents. You need to be smart about how you activate him and where you assign these readiness tokens. Prime can be activated several times during each round as long as you've got the appropriate number of activation tokens ready to go. Sounds like it's going to be a bit of a long game, choosing which subsystem you assign things to, building up that power until Prime's ready to attack. And then you've got still a whole other force of models that you need to think about. I honestly wasn't expecting this level of strategy. I think a lot of folks thought that Prime would just be a blunt instrument, but looks like you're gonna have to be a little bit smart about how and when you activate Prime. That's all well and good. We now know how Prime works, but how do you bring him down? Well, as mentioned, you have to target these subsystems. So when you perform an attack on Liberty Prime as the target, you can choose to aim at a specific subsystem at the exchange of a skill test penalty. Alternatively, you can aim at whatever part of Prime you want, and if you hit, you make a roll on this chart here on the armor die. Depending on what you roll and depending on what type of attack it is, will determine what subsystem you end up hitting. But if you want to target a specific subsystem, then you can do so, but essentially it's treated as a quick attack. So you get a -2 penalty to that roll. So once you've determined what part of Prime you're actually hitting, then you use the unit's armor value on these cards here to then determine if you actually go through. And look at those armor values. They're nuts. If you think Frank Horrigan was tough with that 6 armor, say hello to Prime with 6+1. Strong armor on his first card. Second card, 5+1 strong armor. Oh my god. And third one, 4+1 strong armor. So he's still an absolute tank all the way across the board. And these subsystems look pretty tough. Power Core, for example, has 15 hit points all by itself. And once 3 of Liberty Prime's subsystems have been damaged, the Brotherhood of Steel Elders will order the immediate evacuation of Liberty Prime from the battlefield. And although certainly not destroyed, it is considered a casualty for scoring purposes of the scenario. It's also considered as 10 casualties during scenarios where kills count towards victory conditions. So taking Prime down looks like an auto win, but yeah, not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. And interestingly enough, if you are able to take Prime down, you assign a stun token to all other models on the battlefield within the same force as Liberty Prime. So if you're able to take this monstrosity down, the shock and awe of such a kill will stun the rest of the enemy's force. Not bad. Now this next section here is interesting because it's all about how Prime interacts with terrain and other objects on the battlefield. Because Prime is so big, there's a whole new strata of terrain added to the game when he's on the board, and that's whether or not terrain is destructible by Liberty Prime or not destructible by Liberty Prime. Before playing any game with Prime, you and your opponent need to go through each piece of terrain on the board and decide if it's passable by Prime, impassable by Prime, destructible by Prime, not destructible by Prime, because it will influence how the model is able to move across the battlefield and also how your models will interact with that terrain. Any piece that you decide is destructible by Liberty Prime, if Prime moves any part of his base through it, that piece of terrain is destroyed. It's held and set to 0, and it's removed, and rubble is put in its place. Where that terrain once stood is now considered difficult terrain for other models to move through, and it also does a neat little item drop, which is kind of cool, because when terrain is destroyed by Liberty Prime's movement, place a random searchable token in that area. Any items from this newly placed searchable marker do not count towards scenario objectives, but it essentially gives you another way to get more searchables on the board. It's an interesting mechanic and kind of represents Prime just tearing through the battlefield, leaving all kinds of goodies and rubble in his wake. Now, the strategy of Prime comes into play again really quickly here when it comes to Prime moving over top of markers on the battlefield. Liberty Prime can end their move action with the base overlapping markers on a battlefield. Now, markers and tokens which are under Prime's base may never be interacted with until Prime is no longer overlapping them. You might be thinking, okay, great, well then Prime is the ultimate objective denying unit. Just put him on top of a, scenario essential objective and you've denied your enemy any chance of interacting with it, right? Wrong. And here's why. Because just like how you and your opponent need to decide if there's any terrain that Prime can interact with, you also need to decide if there's any scenario essential markers. Now, there are only 4 types of markers and tokens which can be considered scenario essential, and they're listed here: searchables, investigation markers, computer tests, and lockpick tests. And if Prime ever overlaps one of those, then the opposing force gets to interact with that marker still, and they actually get to interact with it orange range distance away from Liberty Prime's base. We're getting a little bit into the weeds of the tactics of Prime with this rule here, but keep in mind that if you're ever covering a scenario essential marker, that you might be giving your opponent an easier time of interacting with it because they can interact with Prime's base instead of the marker. And lastly, for movement, Liberty Prime also displaces other models which he gets in the way of. If the displaced model is in the same force as Liberty Prime and you overlap its base, then you assign a stun marker to it. So he'll always be either pushing the enemy one bit here and there, but if you ever cover your own models, you accidentally stun them. Kind of cool. And the last part here, before we take a look at the scenarios, is playing against an AI-controlled Liberty Prime. Just like every unit in Wasteland Warfare, Prime can be played as an AI solo opponent. And there's a whole set of specific rules. He's got a unique AI card here, which can determine which weapon he uses. And basically, anytime you roll a mushroom cloud, you're gonna get the nuke. Once 3 subsystems have been damaged, Prime has no tokens remaining. He gets removed as per usual. But interestingly, Prime counts as 3 AI token enemies when on the board, so you can actually activate Prime multiple times in a round when you're fighting them. That's the long and the short of Liberty Prime's rules, and gives you a good idea of how you can field this unit on the battlefield, either as part of your force or as an AI adversary. The last half of the rules expansion is actually a scenario pack of 3 separate scenarios, and you can either play them individually or as a linked campaign, and there's all kinds of cool mechanics in here, all about Liberty Prime and the Brotherhood of Steel taking on an enemy force and trying to destroy their main base. It's all very reminiscent of the Fallout 3 DLC Broken Steel. So I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of folks playing Brotherhood of Steel versus Enclave with this scenario pack, because it's awesome and it ends in just an all-out knockdown, drag-em-out battle. I think the wait was worth it, having checked this out. I think there's gonna be a lot of happy folks with this expansion pack. And speaking of Liberty Prime campaign and scenarios, I've got some pretty big plans for this campaign pack when it comes to WGNR and the channel here. Want to get this filmed and want to get a series of this done. But first, I need to get my hands on the Liberty Prime model, which is proving to be much more difficult than one would imagine. It's always sold out on the Modifius web store. Trying to track one down secondhand, these things are harder to get their hands on than a fusion core. It's taken a while, but I'm giving you my guarantee right now that one of these days, sooner than later, there will be a 3-part Liberty Prime campaign on this channel, whenever I can find and afford the model. Speaking of which, if you want to support the channel and help WGNR get our hands on one of these monstrosity models, then consider heading on over to our Patreon page. There you can get all kinds of benefits, including double entry into future WGNR giveaways, access to exclusive polls where you get to help us decide the future direction of content here on the channel, and you can even become a named character in a future live stream or battle report. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this Prime breakdown, and as always, stay tuned because WGNR will be back.